Far away in the warm sea, where winter never came, lay the Flower Islands, wisely ruled by Queen Marena. This was not a single kingdom, but an entire archipelago, where every shore preserved its own season. On the Isle of White Gardens, it was always spring. The scents of jasmine, apple blossoms, and damp young grass mingled in the clear air. On the Isle of Red Camellias, a cool autumn dwelled, quietly rustling crimson leaves among dark cliffs. And over the Isle of Night Lilies, the warm summer twilight never faded, and silver flowers opened beneath the moon. Here, time did not move in a circle, but flowed from shore to shore. The Queen's elder daughter, Ilaria, knew every island not as a possession, but as a living being with breath, a voice, and a changing mood. She could hear when the gardens rejoiced in the rain, and when the seagrass whispered anxiously before the wind. Queen Marena had 2 daughters, and each reflected the soul of the Flower Islands in her own way. The elder, Ilaria, was quiet and thoughtful. She could gaze at the water for a long time, discern unease in the rustle of leaves, and hear more in another person's silence than others heard in a long speech. The younger, Mireia, was entirely different, quick, lively, sharp-minded and observant. She was not afraid of uncomfortable questions, and noticed falsehood before it had time to hide behind a smile. But the sisters never competed. They trusted each other as 2 hands trust a single heart. Ilaria felt, Mireia understood. One guarded warmth, the other found a way out. Together they formed a single whole, like the root and flower of one plant. And soon that bond became their support, stronger than the palace walls. One morning, the peaceful ringing of the garden bells was drowned out by the low horn of a ship entering the harbour beneath the silver and blue banner of the north. The messenger brought not a letter, but a sealed decree from the Queen of all islands, the powerful Severa, who ruled a cold archipelago beyond the misty seas. She called herself sovereign of every scrap of land surrounded by water, and demanded that all ruling houses acknowledge her supremacy. By ancient custom, every young heiress who had come of age was required to appear at the northern court, bow before the throne, and affirm Severa's authority aloud. This ritual was called an honour, but everyone knew it resembled a tribute. Now Ilaria's turn had come. The scroll bore the date of her arrival and cold words that allowed no refusal. And it was as though a long northern shadow had fallen across the flowering gardens. Marena stood for a long time by the open window, watching the warm wind sway the garden's white branches. She knew Severa better than most. Her cold pride, her habit of turning another's beauty into cause for envy, and every word into a hidden trap. Refusing the journey was impossible. Severa would then have a lawful pretext to interfere in the life of the Flower Islands. And so the Queen, overcoming a mother's fear with a ruler's duty, agreed. She began preparing Ilaria for the journey. She taught her not to rush her answers, to recognize a threat hidden behind courtesy, and not to justify herself before those who had already decided to accuse her. At Severa's court, Morena would say, silence is sometimes wiser than truth spoken at the wrong time. She outfitted her daughter as though for a celebration, but in her heart sent her away as though to war, knowing that the most dangerous battles take place in throne rooms. By evening, Ilaria's ship entered the narrow harbour of the northern island. There were no gentle shores here, nor any warm wind scented with salt and flowers. Piercing air whistled over black cliffs, and the sea struck the stone in heavy, steel-grey waves. Severa's palace rose above the shore as a vast, motionless white mass. Nothing living grew in its gardens. Roses and tulips had been carved from marble and rock crystal. They shone with flawless beauty, but gave off no scent at all. The air seemed thin and rang with such silence that the island itself appeared to be holding its breath. Even the sun shone dimly here, gliding over the icy towers. Ilaria understood. She had come from a world where beauty lived, into a world where it had been forced to remain still forever. Inside, Severa's palace dazzled with cold brilliance. Mirrored floors reflected every movement. Crystal chandeliers burned with an even white light, and the high walls returned even a whisper in an echo that was far too clear. Courtiers glided smoothly and soundlessly through the halls, as though they were parts of an intricate mechanism wound by someone else's hand. They spoke in rehearsed, impeccably measured phrases and laughed briefly, almost inaudibly, only when Severa herself smiled. Their beautiful faces remained motionless masks of courtesy, but Ilaria noticed anxiety in their lowered eyes and tense fingers. Everyone here was afraid of making a mistake, stumbling over a word, showing too much feeling, or saying the wrong thing. Even joy seemed a duty, sorrow a weakness, while silence itself demanded caution. This was a court where everyone smiled, but no one was happy, where the glitter of jewels only emphasized the dullness of their eyes, and sincerity was considered more dangerous than insolence. The celebration in Ilaria's honor was lavish, but there was no joy in it. When a young maid serving wine stumbled and dropped a silver tray, the sound of the shattered goblet pierced the hall. Everyone froze, awaiting Severa's anger. But Ilaria was the first to approach the girl, kneel beside her, and help gather the shards. "Do not be afraid," she said softly. "A mistake does not make you any less worthy." The maid raised an unbelieving gaze to her, and a barely perceptible whisper passed through the hall. Later, in the garden, Ilaria saw an old gardener carefully clearing frost from the icy roses. She praised not the cold perfection of the flowers, but his patience and skillful hands. The old man remained silent for a long time, as though he had forgotten how to accept gratitude, and then smiled for the first time. Thus Ilaria brought two forgotten things into the palace: compassion for another's mistake and respect for another's labour. And it was precisely this simplicity that frightened the court more than any open defiance. The change began with things that were almost imperceptible. The young maid, who until recently had turned pale at every stern glance, smiled at Ilaria, openly and gratefully for the first time. The old gardener, who had previously answered only with a bow, suddenly began speaking about how he could tell the mood of every icy rose. By the window, two courtiers forgot to exchange their customary compliments and quietly began telling each other about their children. For one brief moment, it was as though the palace thawed. Voices grew gentler, movements freer, and a living light appeared in their eyes. Severa saw everything. Her beautiful face twisted with a fury too strong to conceal behind a smile. She knew how to make people bow, keep silent, and fear her. But neither power nor cold perfection could inspire love. Ilaria received it without demanding anything. Severa understood. Her icy court had begun to melt from the warmth of one kind heart. That she could not forgive. The ritual was over, and in the morning, Ilaria's ship waited at the palace's cold pier. Severa came out to see her guest off, surrounded by silent courtiers. Her parting words were smooth and cold, like the icy roses in the garden. "I hope your journey home will be peaceful," she said, with flawless courtesy, "and that nothing bad ever happens in your warm kingdom." The words sounded like a good wish, but in the Queen's unmoving eyes, Ilaria saw undisguised hatred. She bowed without allowing her unease to show on her face and boarded the ship. When the northern palace disappeared behind the mist, Ilaria breathed in the salty sea air with relief. And yet there was no peace. A vague feeling had settled in her heart, as though an invisible thorn from an icy rose had followed her across the sea. When Ilaria's ship entered the warm harbour of the Flower Islands, Morena immediately noticed the unease in her daughter's eyes. Ilaria told her about the icy court, the strange parting words, and the hatred Severa had been unable to hide. The Queen listened in silence, and then squeezed her hands tightly. "Severa's envy is a slow poison," she said. "She will not strike at once. She will wait for the most opportune and most painful hour. Now she will be watching you." To protect her daughter, Morena demanded a difficult promise. For 6 months, until the seasons changed, Ilaria was not to leave the palace garden under any circumstances. Within the walls of our home, her magic is powerless. Ilaria agreed, seeing fear struggle with duty inside her mother. Thus love raised invisible walls around her, meant to protect her from another's envy, and so began 6 months of silence. Ilaria kept her promise. She did not venture beyond the palace garden, read beneath the jasmine arbor, listened to the murmuring fountains, and spent long hours talking with Maria. The first month passed in expectation of bad news, the second in cautious hope. By the third, Marena looked towards the northern horizon less often, and by the fourth, her former calm had returned to her voice. No letters, messengers, or alarming rumours came from Severa. On the Isle of White Gardens, the apple blossoms fell. Above the night lilies, silver moons drifted slowly, and the red camellias rustled beneath a cool wind. Gradually, everyone began to think that Severa had forgotten Ilaria or turned her envy toward someone else. Peace returned to the Flower Islands, and the silence lasted so long that it was mistaken for peace. The final evening of the 6th month arrived. The prohibition was to end the very next day, and Ilaria would once again be free to leave the palace garden. Music, laughter, and the ringing of bells drifted from the valley beyond the walls, where the flowering of the meadow grasses was being celebrated. "Mother, let me go for just 1 hour," Ilaria asked. "I have not seen people or a real celebration for so long." Marena was silent. Unease still stirred in her heart, but as she looked at the longing in her daughter's eyes, she thought that a single evening could no longer change anything. Severa had not made herself known for half a year, and only 1 night remained until the promise ended. "Very well, my child," the Queen finally said, "but be careful." Thus love, weary of fear, yielded for a single evening, and that one evening was all fate needed. Ilaria and Maria reached the meadow when the celebration was at its height. To the sound of flutes and tambourines, people whirled in dance, while wreaths of cornflowers, clover, and golden grasses swayed on their heads. Ilaria laughed with everyone else, happy for the first time in half a year to see not palace walls before her, but the wide evening sky. But the instant the sun touched the distant hills, the air changed. Thick green mist began rising from the damp earth. It smelled not of grass or meadow flowers, but of something unfamiliar, sweet, cold, and enchanted. The mist slowly coiled around the dancers' legs, rose to their faces, and muffled the music. The flutes grew quieter, the laughter broke off, and movements became slow. Even Maria, who had been alert only a moment before, suddenly lowered her arms sleepily. It seemed as though everyone had breathed in green wine and fallen together into a strange, heavy slumber. Ilaria stood in the middle of the meadow, wrapped in green mist, and everything around her seemed distant, as though hidden behind a thin veil of sleep. Suddenly the earth beneath her feet became soft and warm. The grass trembled ever so slightly, while the cornflowers, clover, and tall meadow stalks began moving soundlessly aside, obeying some invisible command. A perfect green circle formed around Ilaria. Then the ground slowly opened, without a crack or rumble. It did not resemble a terrifying collapse. It seemed as though an enormous palm, woven from roots, moss, and grass, had opened beneath her to gently take her into its embrace. Ilaria had no time to cry out or become afraid. The earth softly lowered her down, as though into a deep cradle, then immediately closed above her, leaving only swaying flowers in the meadow. The mist wavered over the circle, concealing the last movement of the green hand. Mireia saw her sister sink smoothly into the opening earth, but she could not take a single step. The green mist had bound her body in a heavy slumber. She wanted to scream, reach out her hand, and hold Ilaria back, but her fingers would not obey, and her voice froze in her throat. A moment later, roots, grass, and flowers closed over the vanished princess. Not a crack or a bent stalk remained on the even meadow. The mist dispersed as suddenly as though one invisible breath had carried it away. The flutes began to play again, and the dancers awoke and looked around in confusion, not understanding why they had stopped. Only Mireia did not move. She stared at the empty place where her sister had stood only moments before, and horror gradually drove away the remnants of sleep. Ilaria had disappeared without a trace and without a sound, leaving behind the faint scent of unfamiliar flowers and a gaping emptiness in Mireia's heart. Ilaria did not fall. The earth gently carried her downward, and she descended slowly, like an autumn leaf on a windless day. Soon the dark passage opened, revealing an enormous underground valley before her. There was no sun here, but the cavern's high vault shone with a soft, pearly light, like the sky during the season of white nights. An astonishing garden stretched all around. Golden fruit glowed on dark branches. Unknown flowers opened among silver grass, and birds with transparent wings sang in the foliage. In the center of the valley, a crystal-clear spring flowed from beneath a smooth stone, filling the silence with its steady murmur. The air was warm and still, scented with sweet herbs. This place did not resemble a prison. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly deserted. Ilaria looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the garden answered her only with the song of invisible birds. Ilaria stood amid the unfamiliar garden, still unable to understand how she had come to be underground. The warm air seemed peaceful, but the deserted silence was more unsettling than any noise. Suddenly, a dark shadow flickered between the luminous trees, and a small dog ran silently onto the path. He was nothing like the pampered lapdogs of the palace. Slender and smooth-coated, with strong, agile legs, he carried himself warily and independently. His fur gleamed the colour of wet silver, like pebbles on a moonlit shore. The dog did not bark, wag his tail, or come closer. He stopped some distance away and looked attentively at Ilaria with serious, almost human eyes. There was neither threat nor affection in that gaze, only calm, deep observation. It seemed that the garden's silent guardian had come to discover who had disturbed his long solitude. Ilaria cautiously stepped towards the dog, but he immediately retreated, keeping several paces between them. He watched her closely until he was certain she meant no harm. Then the dog turned, walked a short distance ahead, and glanced back over his shoulder, as if inviting her to follow. He led her silently along the garden's narrow paths, neither barking nor whining. First he brought her to a clear spring, flowing from beneath a white stone. Ilaria drank the cool water, while the dog waited patiently beside her. Then he showed her trees, bearing soft golden fruit. Their sweet flesh quickly satisfied her hunger. There was intelligence and precision in his every movement. He knew where to find water, which fruits were safe, and where it was best not to step. His care was restrained and stern, but for that very reason, Ilaria felt, for the first time, that she was not entirely alone. When Ilaria had satisfied her hunger and thirst, the dog led her to a distant cliff, looming dark at the edge of the underground valley. A narrow entrance to a small cave was hidden among the stones. Inside, it was not damp and cold as she had expected, but surprisingly warm. The walls were covered in shimmering moss that spread a soft greenish pearl light. The same moss lay on the floor in a thick, springy layer, and yielded beneath her palm like warm velvet. Exhausted by the journey and fear, Ilaria went inside and lowered herself onto this quiet bed. The dog remained at the entrance. He did not cross the threshold, but merely curled up, rested his head on his front paws, and grew still, listening to the garden. That evening, the simple cave seemed cozier to Ilaria than the palace chambers. She understood that there was not another person anywhere around her, and yet she was not alone. In the morning, Ilaria awoke to the spring's soft murmur and the gentle pearly light entering the cave. The dog was still sitting at the entrance, gazing vigilantly into the underground garden, as though he had not closed his eyes all night. Ilaria studied his dark, silvery fur for a long time, and suddenly remembered the yew trees in her mother's garden. Strong, silent trees that feared neither wind nor time. "I will call you Yew," she said softly. The dog raised his head. The former aloofness vanished from his gaze. Now there was recognition in it, clear, conscious, and so sorrowful that Ilaria's heart tightened. It was as though the name had opened an invisible door behind which a living soul had waited for many years. Yu slowly approached her, and for the first time rested his head in her lap. Months passed. At first, Ilaria listened every morning for a familiar voice from above. But gradually, she stopped waiting for immediate rescue. She accepted the silence of the underground world and began making a life there. She explored distant paths, found flowers she had never seen before, and gave them names. She called one stream the Silver Brook, a small grotto the House of Echoes, and a clearing filled with luminous fruit the Garden of Stars. From smooth branches, Ilaria made a small table and a low chair. Bowls fashioned from large nutshells, dried herbs, and stones she had found appeared on the tabletop. Her life became simple, but not poor. Each day brought a small discovery. Yu always walked beside her, stopped when she grew tired, and was the first to notice new paths. In this way, the prison gradually became a kingdom where Ilaria was not a captive, but its true mistress. In the silence of the underground garden, Ilaria's hearing grew keener. Gradually, she learned to distinguish the voices of birds unlike any she had ever known. Some warned of approaching warm rain. Others called their chicks to the luminous trees, and the smallest sang before the vault's dawn-like glow. Beside the crystal spring, Ilaria tended delicate flowers with transparent petals. She loosened the soil, watered their roots, and noticed that in response they began to shine more brightly, as though thanking her. Every evening, Ilaria sat at the entrance to the cave and softly sang songs she had heard in childhood. Yu settled at her feet, bowed his head, and listened so attentively that he seemed to understand every word and preserve every memory. Thus her world was filled not with speeches, but with the rustling of leaves, murmuring water, birdsong, and soft light. Deprived of human company, Ilaria discovered a living language older than words, the language of nature and silent devotion. As time passed, Ilaria noticed more and more peculiarities in Yu that no ordinary dog possessed. When she sang a sad song, he came over and rested his head in her lap, as though he wished to share her sorrow. And the moment the melody turned cheerful, the tip of his tail began to move, almost imperceptibly, in time with it. One day, on a distant path, Ilaria failed to notice a dark crevice. Yu growled sharply, blocked her way, and did not move until she saw the danger. He never brought her bones or captured game. Instead, he found glowing stones in deep grottos and carefully arranged them at the entrance to the cave. Ilaria felt ever more clearly that beside her was not a pet, but an equal companion. In his silent care, she saw the traits of someone who had once made an ancient and unbreakable vow of loyalty. Yu had his own secret evening ritual. When Ilaria fell asleep on the soft moss, he quietly rose and went to the cave's far wall. There, among the dark stones, a narrow crack led towards the surface. Through it came a barely visible ray of real moonlight, living, cold, and distant. Yu sat before it and remained motionless for hours. The silver light fell across his muzzle, and such profound longing appeared in his serious eyes that it seemed he was remembering another sky, a lost form, and a life to which he could not return. Sometimes Ilaria awoke and watched him in silence. She longed for home. He longed for the world he had lost. And their two sorrows, meeting in the quiet, became a single hope of return. One morning, Ilaria awoke earlier than usual and immediately sensed that something in the cave had changed. The entrance was empty. Yu stood some distance away beside the path leading towards the dark crevices, looking at her with an unusual, profound sadness. He slowly approached, touched his cold nose to her palm for the last time, and held her gaze. That silent look contained a farewell Ilaria did not wish to understand. "You, where are you going?" she whispered. But he turned away and walked off without looking back. His silvery fur flashed several more times between the stones, then vanished into the deepest passages, where Ilaria had never dared to venture. She called for him until her voice was hoarse, and waited beside the path until evening. But Yu did not return. He left as quietly as he had appeared, leaving behind a deafening silence. Throughout the next day, Ilaria searched for Yu along the familiar paths, beside the spring, among the luminous trees, and in the distant grottos. She called him until her voice grew faint, but the garden answered only with the rustle of leaves. The following morning, as she emerged from the cave, Ilaria noticed a grey-haired old man in a traveller's cloak at the very edge of the valley. He was walking slowly towards the white mist, and there was something painfully familiar in his gait. "Wait!" she cried and rushed after him. The old man did not turn around. His figure dissolved into the mist before Ilaria could draw near. She stopped, overcome with despair, and at that very moment, a warm, luminous cloud rose around her. It gently touched her face and hands as though it recognized her, then completely concealed the underground garden. The cloud did not frighten Ilaria. It was warm and soft, and smelled of ozone, damp earth, and wildflowers after rain. Gathering her up as though in invisible hands, it slowly rose above the garden and carried her upward through the cavern's stone vault. Ilaria felt neither heaviness nor fear, only a light spinning sensation, like awakening after a long sleep. Suddenly, bright sunlight flared before her, and an endless blue sky opened overhead. The cloud gently lowered her onto the soft grass and melted into the warm air. Ilaria looked around. The same meadow grasses bloomed all around her. Familiar bells rang, and the palace roofs gleamed in the distance. This was the very meadow from which she had disappeared many months before. She was finally home. At the palace, Ilaria was welcomed with tears, embraces, and the joyful ringing of bells. Her return seemed a miracle, but along with it came bitter news. Queen Morena, exhausted by long grief and illness, had relinquished her power several days earlier, passed the crown to her elder daughter, and withdrawn to a quiet house by the sea. Ilaria had not yet recovered from Yu's disappearance, yet fate already demanded new decisions from her. She accepted the crown, but set one condition. Mireia would rule beside her, becoming her advisor and right hand. The young queen's first decree astonished the entire court. It concerned neither taxes, celebrations, nor borders. Search the whole world for a small silver dog named Yu. Thus Ilaria ascended the throne, remaining faithful to the one who had not abandoned her in the darkness. Even when almost no hope remained, the search continued for many days, but neither sailors, hunters, nor wandering merchants had encountered a small silver dog. One day, as Ilaria sat on the throne, tired and sorrowful, the doors of the hall flew open. On the threshold stood the same grey-haired old man she had seen in the underground garden. He bowed slowly. "I have heard of your decree, O Queen. I know the fate of this dog, and I can bring him back. But my service carries a high price." "Name your price," Ilaria said. The old man smiled, and cold calculation flickered in his eyes. "I will return your faithful dog, if you promise before all your people to become my wife." Ilaria froze. Her heart yearned for you, but the very thought of surrendering her future to a stranger filled her with unease and revulsion. He was offering to return the past at the cost of all her freedom. Ilaria was already about to voice the fateful agreement. Her longing for you drowned out caution, and the hope of seeing him again seemed worth more than her own freedom. But before she could answer, Mireia rose from her seat and approached the throne. "Do not do this," she said softly but firmly. "You must not give yourself away for hope while the truth remains unknown." Then she turned to the old man. "Your words smell of deceit. If you truly can return the dog, bring him first, and the queen will reward you generously. But if you cannot, leave." Under her clear, penetrating gaze, the old man stepped back. It was as though Ilaria awakened from a trance, and she refused him, His face then twisted with rage. Muttering curses, he disappeared in grey smoke. Thus Mirea's sharp mind became a shield for her sister's kind heart, and a word spoken in time proved stronger than treachery. The day after the old man's disappearance, ships with emerald sails entered the harbour of the Flower Islands. They were led by Prince Renal, ruler of a distant archipelago. Granted an audience, he appeared before Ilaria and told her the truth. "I was you," he said. "Severa turned me into a dog because, during a hunt long ago, I refused to bow before her. She imprisoned me in the underground garden, depriving me of my name and human form. The garden's guardian had helped him escape, but the final part of the curse demanded a test. Renal had to appear before Ilaria as a grey-haired old man and offer to return you in exchange for marriage. Only her freely given refusal could break the spell. When he raised his eyes, Ilaria recognized the same silent devotion in them. A handsome prince stood before her, but her heart already knew him as the small silver dog who had shared her loneliness and carefully guarded her in the darkness. Everyone expected that after Renal's confession, an impending wedding would be announced at the palace. But Ilaria and the prince were no longer thinking only of their own happiness. "Before we celebrate our love," the queen said, "we must put an end to the fear that has ruled the islands for so many years." At their summons, the rulers of distant archipelagos arrived in the Flower Kingdom. The Council of the Islands assembled in the Great Hall. Ilaria spoke of her abduction, Renal of the curse and his long years of imprisonment. For the first time, the truth about Severa's cruelty was spoken aloud. Many lowered their eyes, recognizing their own long-held pain in the story. "Will we continue to bow before one whose power rests on humiliation and fear?" Ilaria asked. "Or will we refuse together to obey her?" Silence reigned in the hall. Their personal fairy tale became the beginning of a great story of liberation. Ilaria and Renal's words awakened in the rulers the courage that had hidden beneath submission for many years. One after another, kings and queens rose from their seats and renounced the oaths they had sworn to Severa out of fear. And with every refusal spoken aloud, it seemed to grow brighter over the islands. At that very moment, far to the north, the enormous mirror in Severa's throne room began to dim. For years, it had fed on the admiration, bows, and silent terror of others. Now thin cracks crept across its silver surface. The queen's reflection faded, and its cold brilliance died. A moment later, only a cloudy piece of glass remained before Severa. Along with the mirror, her magical power vanished. No one stormed the palace or raised a sword. Severa remained alone on the rocky island, not defeated, but simply powerless. because people had ceased to fear her. The islands were freed, and a new era began over the sea. A time of peace, alliances, and open roads. Returning home with Rennell, Ilaria brought to the royal garden a small, unremarkable seed she had secretly kept after her underground imprisonment. She planted it in the most honored place, beside the bright spring. Soon a slender shoot rose from the earth, and after several years, an extraordinary tree grew there. Twice a year it changed its attire. In spring, the branches were covered in dazzling white flowers, pure as hope. In autumn, deep crimson, almost black buds opened upon them, preserving the memory of the darkness and sorrow that had been endured. You, now Rennell's ordinary and happy dog, loved to lie in the tree's shade. Thus the underground garden continued to live above the earth, reminding everyone that beauty can grow even from the deepest darkness. When all secrets had been revealed, the oaths revoked, and Severa's power had vanished, Ilaria and Rennell found themselves free of another's will for the first time. Rennell remained on the Flower Islands, but not as a rescued prince indebted to his savior, nor as a bridegroom appointed to her by fate. He remained because he loved Ilaria, her quiet strength, kindness, and ability to see a living heart behind any form. Ilaria chose him freely as well, not out of gratitude for the underground garden, nor out of pity for the curse he had endured, but because beside him she could be herself. They had passed through fear and separation to gain a rare freedom, to simply be together, without conditions or debts. And so their love became not a reward for a completed adventure, but the beginning of a new life shared between them. Ilaria and Rennell's wedding was held quietly in the royal garden, beneath the branches of the tree that bloomed with the memory of light and darkness. Then they united their islands and ruled for a long time, wisely and without fear, remembering that power should not force heads to bow, but protect living hearts. Yet even after becoming king and queen, they kept the habits born in the underground silence. Rennell always remained her silent protector, as steadfast as you. And Ilaria was for him that one living flower he guarded tenderly, without depriving it of freedom. Sometimes in the evenings, he sat at her feet, and together they silently remembered their secret garden. Their story became a legend about a love that begins not with admiration for a face, title, or beauty. True love is born in the quiet recognition of a kindred soul, even if it once hid beneath the form of a small silver dog.